What I'd like to try to do today, in addition to what Dan just described, looking at some of my reconstructions of pastoralist activity in the Kashmir Valley, is also give a sort of broad geographic and archaeological overview of Central Asia, because it's not a particularly well-known region of the world outside of the people working there, and start to, in the spirit of the workshop, look at the human activities that have taken place there, and start to pick apart some of the proxies that could be used to reconstruct those early human impacts there. Particularly because, as I'd like to emphasise today, this is actually there's a lot more diversity in what people are doing there than what has been presumed to have been undertaken in the past. So when we talk about Central Asia very broadly, we typically think of the former Soviet Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. But culturally and geographically, we can also start to encompass the northern part of the South Asian subcontinent, northeastern Iran, Afghanistan, Xinjiang, and parts of the Tibetan Plateau, and Mongolia also. So even looking at this this satellite image, we see a huge diversity of landscapes, a very broad area, and very sharply defined ecological zones as well. So in the north, we have the Eurasian steppe, with various gradients of forest steppe, grassland steppe, artemisial steppe, desert steppe. We have the deserts in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and also Xinjiang, east and west of this, what's been termed this inner Asian mountain corridor, which is what we have at the centre, which is what I'll mostly be talking about today. This area has been a focus of archaeological research, looking at human activities dating back about 5,000 years. And I'll just touch on a few important zones in there today. Kashmir Valley in the south here, the Fergana Valley that runs through several countries in the west, and also Semi-Rich, which is the sort of river basin in southeast Kazakhstan. So the topography and the ecology of this region really gives rise to a lot of small ecotopes that allow for a variety of human activities, from agriculture on alluvial fans and in foothill areas, herding in middle and high altitude pastures, and also there's other secondary activities we'll see taking place, like forestry, mining, and things like that. So broadly, Central Asia, it's a winter precipitation controlled environment, westerly controlled environment. As Dan just mentioned, we do have the interplay of the summer monsoon and the Siberian anticyclone here also. And we've had numerous Holocene climate reconstructions that have been undertaken using lake records, Lurs and Paleosol records, and speleothems. But these reconstructions they're regional in scale, and they're not focused on these local human environment interactions that I want to get at today. So just to emphasize again, these are different photos I've taken wandering about the place. This diversity of environments obviously going to give a rise to a numerous array of human adaptations and impacts on the environment in this area. So the Holocene human adaptations, what are people actually doing? What am I talking about? From about 9,000 BP onwards, we have this development of sort of the West Asian Neolithic package spreading into the foothill zones of the Copper Darg in southern Turkmenistan, northeastern Iran. From about 5,000 BP, we have steppe pastoralism developing in the northwestern areas that then begins to spread eastward from there. And we also get the development in this mountain corridor that I've been talking about of transhumance pastoralism, or agro-pastoralism, or multi-resource pastoralism. It's been given a number of terms. This really becomes a catch-all category for describing the ways that people are incorporating various summer and winter agriculture, herding patterns, forestry, metallurgy across this mountain zone. So based on perhaps historical biases or just poor understanding of the region, these steppe pastoralism or transhumant pastoralism, what people generally think of when they think of Central Asia. These are generally thought of as low impact activities, people moving some animals through the steppe or up and down the mountains, but we don't really think about the way that people are impacting these environments and what they're actually doing. So if you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, wanted to illustrate a nice picture of multi-resource pastoralism I saw in the Kashmir Valley, where people who are presumably fully nomadic Gujjar community who move up and down the mountains from the south, from the Indian plains up into Kashmir, are also undertaking millet cultivation, maize cultivation, in these middle altitude pastures, diverting streams through here for milling of grain. And given the resourcefulness of pastoralists, also this tour bus, like now taking tourists around and herding. So these are really flexible strategies. Why they're important, I think, is that they can respond rapidly to climate shifts. They can really opportunistically exploit environmental niches and be able to really switch their social ecological strategies to suit local conditions quite quickly. So ways that some archaeologists have started looking at agro-pastoralist niche construction through these mountains. Broadly conceived, we're talking about the clearing of forest stands and the opening of meadow landscapes. When you get herding, you get enrichment of nitrogen from animal urine and dung in corrals and around campsites. We've got ethnographic records of the deliberate propagation of herbs palatable to both people and animals. So this is a secondary form of cultivation almost in some ways that we don't really think about. We also get the movement of cereal cultivars, particularly wheat and barley, into these middle and high altitudes. And we also have detrimental impacts through overgrazing. We get erosion, we get ruderal plants and degradation of these niches. So Robert Spengler has argued that this niche enrichment or niche construction by agro-pastoralists is visible in the archaeobotanical record through high representations of chenopodium and other seeds that are deliberately propagated and grazed, that are then collected in animal dung and used as a food resource, a fuel resource, sorry. So we start to see that in on-site archaeological records, but not particularly those things in the environmental record yet. Another case study using geoarchaeological and geomorphic proxies has argued for the interrelationship between archaeological settlements on terraces built up by aggradation, intensification of soil formation by pastoralism and cultivation. And this is one way that that geoarchaeologists, I guess, have started to look at agro-pastoralist niche construction in southeast Kazakhstan. But again, this isn't really getting to the proxy evidence that we're trying to look at in this workshop in the sedimentary record. So to that end, my PhD research started to examine some proxies for agro-pastoralist activity in the mountainous areas of the Kashmir Valley. So from about 5,000 BP, we know that we start to get the development of agricultural villages on the valley floor. This is this landscape you can see in this corner here at about 1,600 meters above sea level. But we don't really know what people are doing in the mountain flanks or if they're doing anything at all. So these are these more forested areas that are interspersed with meadows and subalpine meadows above the timberline that range from about 2,200 to 3,500 meters above sea level. So what I did was I took number of sediment cores from just one small part of one district on the west of the Kashmir Valley, Budgam district. And the assumption I started with was I began with the presumption that these meadows were anthropogenic landscapes. These are basically developed through the accumulated activities of agro-pastoralists on the valley, these mountain areas of the valley, and started to think about the ways that we can begin to understand the ways that these are constructed landscapes. So you'll note that there's a lot of conifers in these photos here, which makes interpreting pollen diagrams from these sediment cores, which are taken from sort of peat bogs and mires in these meadows. But yeah, beginning to, when we start to think about, the opening of the landscape, obviously conifers presents a big problem when you start to talk about, deforestation and things like that, because of their, the high pollen productivity and dispersal of those pollens. So what I did instead was start to think about some more particular indicator proxies from pollens, sediment, charcoal, and coprophagous spores that might be things that can start to tell us about when people started to bring animals into this environment, start to modify and impact it, and also the changes in these impacts and this land utilization through time. So individually, a lot of these proxies might not necessarily be indicators of human activity, but once we start to see them all start to vary together and start to go in the same direction, I think that we can build a strong case strong case for agro-pastoralist impacts in these mountain areas in Kashmir. So some of the typical proxies we used were increases in grass pollen. This is from a lot of ecological literature in Kashmir. This is linked to expansion of grass, lower diversity, and intensified grazing processes. Cereal type pollens obviously might be an indicator of the movement of cultivation off the valley floor and into the mountain areas. Palatable and unpalatable herbs that are associated with patterns of grazing, both in Kashmir and more widely across this mountainous part of Central Asia. Artemisia pollens were one particular proxy that's been well noted in Kashmir, that this is really sensitive to grazing, and anytime you move animals into a new area, this basically disappears. Also, the coprophagous spores that have been looked at across Eurasia or globally for the presence of herbivores. Sedimentary changes that might be indicators of forest clearing and the mobilization of colluvium and erosion induced by the bringing in of big herds of animals. And of course, charcoals that might be indicators of anthropogenic burning of the landscape. So just briefly going through some of my records. So Pari Hus, which is at the lowest elevation from at 2,500 meters above sea level. This is in a meadow area. It's surrounded by areas that are extensively grazed, but also we have cultivation still at this elevation in the Kashmir Valley. So the thing that you'll immediately note is there's a sharp drop in Artemisia at about 2,200 BP. Around the same time, we have sharp increase in grasses. We have cereal type pollens evident in the record from there. And also there's an increase in our three coprophagous spore types. And again, we have increases in charcoal, so maybe intensified burning around the site during this period, and fluctuations and increases in the mean sediment size. So I think if we're talking in terms of human impact, this site at around 2,200 through to about 1,500 BP, we really have this period of I think what starts to look like intensified grazing at this site at Pari Hus. It then drops out of the record for a few hundred years, but I'm not sure if this is a result of overprinting there's a drastic change in sediment from humified muds to clastic sediments. I think there might be some form of environmental process that overprints any kind of human impact. You can also see this big increase in ferns in that time. So there's an onset of a wetter period, I think, around the site, which may have either driven people away or it's overridden any anthropogenic signature we have. But again, at a lower level, we start to get these indicators again increasing from about 500 BP, which sort of indicate maybe a recolonisation, reutilization of this area by agro-pastoralists. Shali Ganga, so this is only about 3 or 4 kilometres south of Pari Hus record, but a few hundred metres higher. This is in a much more marginal opening in the forest landscape. The early human impacts in this, we don't really get anything till about 600 years ago, when again you start to see this increase of viburnum and sambucus pollens, which grow at the margins of cleared forest areas, decrease in artemisia, increase in grasses, and again a burning, high increased burning, a coprophagous spores, and a sharp increase in mean sediment size. So again, taken all together, I think that we can start to interpret this as the impacts of people starting to clear and graze in that environment. Our highest altitude record, Tosmadana, at a bit above 3,000 metres above sea level, goes back much older. This starts to have some indicators of people grazing at this subalpine environment from between about 4,000 and 3,000 BP. The sort of fluctuating proxy indicators might be taken as evidence of agro-pastoralist activity around the site. But again, it's after about 2,000 BP when all of these pollen indicators for enrichment by grazing, grass increases, artemisia decreases, and sediment and spores and charcoal will start to increase again. So to put all of these together and start to interpret them, when I start to pull out the environmental indicators in these records, I think that we have a protracted period of intensification of grazing beginning from about 4,000 BP, but really intensifying slightly before or around 2,000 BP. And this is a period when the Kashmir Valley was integrated into what was known as a Kushan Empire, which was a semi-nomadic or a large Central Asian empire that was of nomadic origin, which began to settle areas to the south and really start to expand settlements and socially and ecologically change lots of parts of South and Central Asia. And I think this is what we're starting to see in the signal in Kashmir, as maybe pressures on the valley floor from incoming populations or population expansions start to drive people to utilise these mountain areas more intensively. The discontinuity and asynchronous evidence for grazing in these records suggests that there's this switching focus of herding activity and agro-pastoral activity through time. Yeah, we can see in the Parihas record where we have the evidence of cereal cultivation potentially. This is also contemporary with the development of these technologies that we get archaeologically across Central Asia for the management of slope runoff. Other human impacts in these records. So when we start to look at the arboreal taxa, I'd just like to note the disappearance of oak pollens from all three of the records, again about 2,000 BP. So this is what we start to see is, if we start to interpret this as a period of intensified human activity, this is also a period of probably maximal aridity in the Kashmir Valley. Oaks are functionally extinct in Kashmir today, but is an element of moist deciduous forests across the Western Himalayas. So with the onset of these drier conditions, we might see that it's already in some form of environmental precarity, and then it's possibly extinct through the use of oaks as fuel in the valley. And we do have in the anthropological record at archaeological sites oaks prior to this period, and then some small abundances of it in the Kushan period, but then it disappears from the charcoal record at archaeological sites from that time onwards. So I think we start to see convergence of environmental change and human impacts. We can make a case for possibly an anthropogenic extinction of oaks in the valley at that time. But also in the two lower elevation records, we start to see a relative increase in walnut pollens, which are endemic since prior to the Ice Age in pollen records in Kashmir. They start to increase from that time, and we know from the historical record that from this time onwards, from the Mughal period onwards, that walnut oil, was used as a form of taxation, and then during the occupation by the British, it was used as gun stocks for the Indian Army. So we might start to see sort of an industrial era expansion of these driving these walnut pollens up. Elsewhere in Central Asia, we also get modification.
Mike, can I get you to wrap it up soon?
Yep, we have high representation of walnut pollens in Kyrgyzstan from about 1,000 BP, which again is pastoralist modification possibly of the forest belt. One final thing I wanted to bring up was from about 4,500 years ago, we have an intensification of mining across all of Central Asia, copper and tin mining, and we might start to think about proxies for that. So again, these are more complex processes than just people herding through these environments. Have diverse ecological, economic, and social strategies that would have a wide range of impacts on proxies that we might be able to start to interpret for this. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It's fantastic. Maybe we've got time for one question if anybody wants to fire one off. I've got a bunch, but I'll hold my tongue for the moment. Okay. I should say that Mike's an archaeologist has been tempted over to the dark side of sediments and Poland and whatnot. So he's a useful man to question about the way we can integrate archaeology into some of these pictures. The question I wanted to ask was that you've got these, what do you call, what other people have called niche creation, and this idea that you've got this kind of flexible adaptive strategy and that allows people to adapt to change quite easily. That makes them hard to see in proxy data. And I think what comes out of your records, I mean, this is an observation rather than a question, I guess, but what comes out of your records is that this multi-proxy approach is critical for triangulating what people are doing, and that any single proxy or even a small subset of those proxies wouldn't show them when you have this, I wouldn't call it a light imprint on the landscape, but a very flexible and adaptable approach to variable environments, I guess. Makes them very hard to see. Would you say that was right?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that, in isolation, that any of those sort of proxy indicators can be interpreted in, either as just random variation or could be environmentally driven or any number of things. But I think that really the multi-proxy approach is critical because, as you said, these, we assume these are low impact activities or they're easily overridden, and you really need to, I think, put a lot of, I think I wanted to emphasize that those biotic and abiotic as well are probably the best way to put those together as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That was fantastic. We might move on, if that's okay, we move on with the next speaker.